Hello, everyone. And I know that India has been in lockdown for quite long now. Of course, not everyone here is from India. The majority of you are. And welcome to everyone who is chiming in from everywhere else in the world. I know that there is at least Singapore and some people from Queen's Belfast. I know that. So we're very happy that Ben Golub has agreed to do the second talk. Of course, Ben wanted to throw us a party, so he didn't come here alone. He brought his co-authors along with us. So I'd also like you to welcome Matt Elliott and Matt Led with us today for this talk. So Ben is going to talk about supply network formation fragility, which is a good topic for these times. So Ben Golub's research in economic theory focuses on social and economic networks. Since 2015, Ben has been in the faculty at Harvard, where he's now associate professor. Prior to that, he spent 2 years as junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. He has received the NSF Career Award and the Early Prentice Prize, along with Matt Elliott, for an outstanding paper by a young economic theorist. Ben got his PhD from Stanford and did his undergraduate at Caltech. Matt Elliott is at Cambridge, and Matt Leduc is at the Paris School of Economics. Both brilliant theorists, and with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Ben for questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat function, and either Matt or Matt will answer, and periodically, I guess, Ben will also answer. I'll let him explain if he wants to handle it differently to you. With that, the floor is yours, Ben.
Thank you very much, Sudipta. It's an honor to present this to this group and to have my co-authors here. So I will jump right in, given the time. The setting we have in mind, the modeling, what motivates our modeling is an environment where there's a supply network and you're making something complicated. Imagine, for example, a big airplane, a modern airliner, and each step in the production has many essential inputs that you need to do that step. And the inputs that are sourced via specific relationships. So Airbus has 4 million parts that are made by 1,500 firms that have this very complicated network of contracts with each other. Since at least Kramer 93, O-rings, and probably before that, it's been understood that these kinds of networked interdependencies, I mean, they were just thinking about a chain, but more generally, networks can propagate disruptions. And just to give you some very quick concrete examples of that, I'll go quick given the time. You can find illustrations in the business press of a failure in a fire at a semiconductor plant that then makes a mobile phone manufacturer shut down production, lose $100 million in sales. Actually, in this case, Ericsson exited the mobile phone business. Strikes at some General Motors parts plants had ripple effects that propagated through the whole supply network that it was involved in and cost GM a lot of money, for GM at least. And there's a big literature, as many of you know, I'm sure, in OR and other kind of allied fields of ours that show that, study things in detail and find empirically that these are serious things within any supply chain, so much so that big companies have whole business units just devoted daily to monitoring these supply chain disruptions. Now, from our perspective, even though individual supply chains might be very sensitive to these shocks, we're not so interested in the fate of a particular company. This is a paper about the whole economy. And so in particular, we care about what this relationship of interdependencies and specific relationships implies for aggregate robustness. And the reason we're not so worried about particular firms is that first, firms will maybe, it's conceivable that firms will bear the efficient level of risk for themselves, right? And so, yeah, they'll fail sometimes, but it'll be when they kind of should fail or should interrupt their production. And then also a large economy is large. So we're not very worried if a single food supply chain in India breaks down, but we're very worried if a sizable percentage of them do, because then the amount of food actually goes down. And the same in US right now for meat production, which is experiencing, not idiosyncratic losses to particular firms, but contractions across the whole industry in a very rapid way. So what we do here is we have a model, a formal model in the style of kind of continuum random graph theory of the strategic formation of a large supply network. And we're going to be studying, both idiosyncratic disruptions, but more importantly, aggregate robustness. And we're going to find that while the economy is very robust in our, basically by construction to idiosyncratic risk, it can be arbitrarily sensitive to very small correlated disruptions. And so shocks to travel costs or institution quality or the courts can make many supply networks contract or collapse simultaneously. And that force is due to the combination of the fact that production is really complex in the sense that I described with this Airbus, and also that there's a lot of reliance on specific relationships in the way production works. So let me, since this is a modeling crowd, let me just lay out let me immediately lay out the model and then we'll talk in much more depth about, how to interpret the primitives. So the first primitive I'm going to introduce is not the network we ultimately focus on, but a primitive called the product network. So there's a set of products. Think of this as, the airplane, then various subparts of the airplane. That's one way to think about it. Or you can think about it as different kinds of services or processes that are performed within an economy. Each product has a continuum of firms that are able to produce it. And the production function of A, let's say, takes everything that A points to, so in this case, B and C, as essential inputs. So you can't make any A product without B and C product. So this arrow means A depends on B. So this is a directed graph called the product network. We're not writing down the exact production function behind these arrows. All we really need, and there's a lot of production functions like this, that if you don't get any B, you can't make any A. Cobb-Douglas will give that to you, various CES will do it. So lots of different ways to model it. And if you buy labor or something on the market that's not specifically sourced, that's not going to be here either. This is just for those relationships where in order to produce some A, you really need to source a specific thing. So think of the airplane sourcing an engine. If you are Airbus to make an airplane, you really need a specific contract with an engine supplier. You can't just go on to Home Depot or on Upwork.com and get your engine, right? That's what these arrows represent. Okay, so that's a key primitive, and please chime in with questions about that. Note that you can have bidirectional relationships between services. For example, legal services and financial services might both companies that make each can source from the other, and that's permitted in the model. So that's the product network, but the network we're really going to be focusing on is what we call the supply network, which is what we imagine is within each of these products, say A, there's a continuum of little firms like this little green dot. And in order to source the stuff it needs, in this case B and C, A has to make links to B producers and C producers. These dashed links are called potential supply relationships. And what they represent is that A has B firms in its Rolodex, for example. These are firms it could potentially call up. These are a set of firms that this A firm could potentially call up and ask to supply B, and similarly for these C firms. So now that is the representation in the picture, and I'll keep coming back to the picture. In fact, I'll try to leave it up here on the side. But let me tell you a little more mathematically what this primitive is. So to build, we don't start with a supply network, we start with a potential supply network, which is a superset in terms of edges. There's all the firms. So a firm here is just given by the product that it makes and an index, which says like what little firm number are you in this continuum of firms. And then there are directed links between firms. So if you want to be very concrete, you can imagine each little firm drawing 3 potential suppliers for each required input. and that so n is going to be the number of potential suppliers, and you can imagine these being drawn uniformly at random, let's say from the supplying industry. Now, to make the realized supply network, you're going to keep edges in this. You're going to include some edges from this potential supply network that are called operational. So in fact, I'll illustrate for you in a moment, but the idea is that not all of these edges are actually going to be suitable to supply the thing. It might be that road between you and that firm doesn't work. That's the simplest case, maybe, or they couldn't answer. They were too busy, couldn't answer the phone when you called, and so they didn't end up, even though the specifications were drawn up and they could have shipped to you. They actually don't manage to do that. And so what we're going to do for the rest of the talk is study the mechanics of the system, basically asking who can produce in the economy and how much can be produced. Will the economy be capable of production at all? And then we're going to endogenize relationship strength and let each firm actually choose the probability that links work. Okay, so here initially, so since this is sort of a techie crowd, I can just tell you that for a while we'll be studying kind of just the random graph theory of what happens if you keep some of these edges at random with probability X and see which firms are capable of production. I'll explain what that means. And take that random graph as exogenous. But later, the link probabilities, which is the probability that any one of these potential edges turns into a real productive edge, that will become endogenous and be a choice variable, and we'll see how the key economic insights actually become, in a sense, more stark. So there's kind of a piece of random graph theory that you might not have seen here, and then economic implications that are distinctive to the novel random graph phenomena that we identify. So let me just stop for a sec, take a quick look at the conversation. Okay, so I just want to answer. So Junji asks, who I'm delighted to see here, asks a good question. So this is actually, Junji says, look, this number of engine suppliers that can help produce an airplane is much less than the continuum, right? And that's exactly what this this n assumption is supposed to represent. So we don't assume that you can source engines from any of okay, there are two things. Of course, even the ambient, the sort of total number of possible firms that can supply engines is not a continuum, but some finite number. And that might be true, although, maybe you can think of them as potential suppliers. That maybe gets a little bit philosophical. But what's definitely true is that, we are modeling the fact that you have only finitely many that you could use, which arguably captures the idea that, at least due to geography or whichever of the businesses have actually gotten into that production process that you need, is very finite. But I take your point that the continuum assumption here is stylized, and we actually don't need it very much. There's a lot of things that hold with, the key economic insights hold with large. I kind of agree with you that airplane might not be the best example, because even the number of potential suppliers is really small. But that modeling choice is for technical reasons, and I think there are lots of markets like medical devices, or where the number of firms that you could contract with is huge, although the number of firms you ever end up talking to is quite finite. And so let me. Maddie, Matt L, is there anything that we should, is there anything you want to bring up from the conversation to date in the audio?
Yeah, there's one other question from Francis Block about whether, saying that the structure that we have here is quite special, and whether this is important. So I think there are various things to say about that. So the part of the structure is that there's a lot of regularity in what we're doing. You have each supplier requires the same number of inputs and has the same number of potential suppliers of those inputs. Those things turn out not to matter. You can have a lot of heterogeneity in a whole different bunch of dimensions, and everything we talk about is going to go through. But getting into why and how that works really is too premature to say that now. Something that technically is useful about the way we set things up, that Mattel mentioned in response, is that the probability that you end up in your own supply chain in our model is 0, and that's useful when we think about the incentives that firms have to do different things.
Yeah, so I guess I want to just add to, I'll be talking about examples, but the fact that supply chains, so there's nothing stopping you from having actually even a countably infinite number of products here and allowing yourself to have long or infinite chains that are directed. So we're not assuming this thing that was this bidirectional relationship or these cycles, they're permitted, but they're not in any way necessary to anything we do. And in fact, one interpretation of our modeling that we like, though not the only one, is indeed just a directed ordinary production chain with many steps. And Matt L, did you start to say something?
No, I was just saying that I had answered a few of these points in the chat window, but just go on re-explaining them. It's actually very useful.
Yeah, I think we'll emphasize some. So everybody should feel very free to talk in the chat, because I think we can just take sort of what we think was the most helpful things to clarify from the chat and amplify them, but try to answer all questions in the chat. So I showed you before just one firm's relationships. Now let's take a little A firm and note that it requires B and C inputs, who in turn require D and C inputs and so forth. And we can plot out those 3 layers. This is the sort of the final layer and its suppliers. You can see higher in this picture is upstream. So these are suppliers, and arrows here represent orders. It's a slightly awkward convention, but you'll see why it makes sense when we do the game theory. An arrow from me to you means I send you orders or source from you, right? And you can see this tree branching kind of upstream from a given final supplier. Now, I told you before that we're going to keep some links with probability X. So here's a visual example. I've grayed out the links that have had a bad realization of being kept. That happened with 1 minus X. And then these links that were kept, that's probability X. And these are so G prime, these are the realized supply links that actually can be used to ship stuff. Think of it like that. And so now, I guess in symbols, we already saw that we're going to take this random subset of links and call them operational. And the first very basic question, just at the level of mechanics of the production function, is which firms can successfully function. So if you think about it a moment, you'll realize that there's a little bit of a fixed point quality to this question, right? Because this big economy, whether I can work depends on whether my suppliers can work. And so I have to answer that question for them, but that depends on yet other people. So let's define a consistent functioning set of firms. Its defining property is that, for each firm that's supposed to be functioning, it has to have at least one functioning producer of each essential input, or supplier. And supplier means someone you have one of these good arrows to, right? So what would be, going back to this picture, what would not be consistent would be saying, for example, C here, C2 is functional, but neither of these guys, or actually it wouldn't be consistent to make C2 functional under any circumstances, because no matter what we say for these guys, it doesn't have working links to a needed input, right? So that would be a simple way that you can be non-functional. And there can be more interesting ways that you can fail to be functional. For instance, even if you had these links, if these guys didn't work, you couldn't be. So there's a notion of a consistent assignment of functionality. You need at least one supplier of each key thing to be functional. And you can define a maximal consistent functioning set. So this is a set of firms that's consistently functional and which contains no superset that's consistently functional. And that's a well-defined thing by standard Tarski kind of reasoning, because in an hour-long talk, I won't get into how that works, but I'll just ask you to take my word for it that there is a maximal consistent functioning set that's unambiguously defined. This is what the economy can produce, okay? And I'll give you some very quick So just to repeat this, right? I already gave you an example of what it means to be, you know, what it means to be not functional. So I'll skip this. But so there's a unique maximal consistent functioning set. It can be found by a simple iterative algorithm, which if you know Tarski fixed point or Eisenberg-Inouye or any of a bunch of kind of iterative procedures, you'll be able to guess how to do it. I won't go through the algorithm, but I do want to show you kind of in a picture what's going on when we figure out who can function. So we're going to imagine, just for simplicity, that all of these guys in the most upstream layer here can successfully produce, okay? And when we realize these link realizations, by the way, I'm going to call these guys pipes. So I'll sometimes say that, you know, C here has no working pipes to source A inputs, right? So you can imagine that these are pipes. Some of them are open, some of them are blocked up, and the blocked up pipes can't ship anything, even if there's something to ship into them. But so first, see, once we make the pipe realizations, we can immediately see, even without making any assumptions about who's functional, as I said before, that a firm like C2 has to fail, basically. It can't produce, right? It has to shut down for a while. Similarly, firm B2 here has to shut down. Once we have realized that, that's sort of the first step of an iterative algorithm. Once we've realized that, we say, oh, look, now, unfortunately, firm A1, this focal firm of ours, lacks a working supplier of a necessary input. Can't source from this guy because the pipe doesn't work, can't source from this guy because he himself can't produce. So that also turns red, and that's bad. And so we can't, now A is removed. And you keep doing this, you keep removing people who can't function given what you know already, and that gets you down to the maximal functioning set that can be consistently sustained. It sort of gives you the production frontier of this economy, conditional on the link failures that happen. So this is a random realization, who can work, that depends on which pipes work or not, of course. But actually, in this continuum economy, the size of that set will be deterministic, even though the details of who can work and who can't are random. So I'm going to state the questions and then turn for a moment back to the conversation. So what we're going to focus on is the share of firms in this maximal functioning set, or equally, you could think of it as, this is a very symmetric economy that we've set up so far. Everybody, if you remember this picture, everybody here, we have a lot of symmetry, as Matt was saying earlier, that everybody in this picture has two necessary inputs, and we're going to imagine them having three potential suppliers, right? So that's just for simplicity, and we can relax that a lot, as much as you want. But in the symmetric economy, one very convenient thing is we can study a one number summary of the functionality of the economy, the reliability, which is just, if you point to a random firm, what's the probability that it can produce? That you can think of, this month, its supply chain is running. And why might that matter? Well, because it might be zero. It might be that no firms in your economy can produce, even though, and not for obvious reasons, but for sort of subtle reasons. Of course, the quantitative thing might matter. In the US, beef production is down by 10%, pork production is down by 25%. That surely is going to have implications for prices and quantities in other industries, and for welfare. And our main finding is going to be that there are these things we call precipices, so that reliability depends discontinuously on X, which is the probability that these pipes work. And then we're going to interpret that and say even small shocks to relationship strength can have very, very stark discontinuous consequences for economic welfare. And in particular, an economy can be very, very susceptible, just for technological reasons, to all the roads working slower or fewer people being able to travel, which is something that we are dealing with now throughout the world. Or all the other restrictions which impede contracting. So let me take a little pause. Matt, co-authors, is there anything that's been in the chat that we should bring up now?
There's been a question about whether the tree needs to be symmetric or if it can be arbitrary. I don't know if you'll talk about this a bit later in the talk.
Yes, I'll get, so I'm going to ask for your forbearance in tolerating some very strong assumptions that we're making for exposition. I'll, of course, in an hour-long talk, I can't show you all the robustness, but at the end of this little section, I'm gonna at least say what we can relax. Maddie, anything we should bring up? Oh,
Sorry,
are you
I was
muted?
on so I'm not sure we fully answered Francis's earlier question because he specified that he was talking about the directed tree structure. So the question is, does our model rely on it being a directed tree? And the answer to that is complicated. So do you want to say something about that,
Well,
or do you want me to?
no, I think you probably have a better answer in mind.
So I think technically it's useful being a directed tree for us. When you're solving the equations and getting a hand on the model analytically, it's very useful that it's a directed tree. And if it wasn't, I'm not sure we'd know how to solve it. On the other hand, I think if we ran simulations where there were small deviations from this, that nothing would break down. So if it was close to being a directed tree, but not exactly a directed tree, then I think we'd be fine. And if you look in data at supply networks at the firm level, they are close to being directed acyclical graphs or directed trees. And you only need to delete a small number of links for that to be true, at least when you're thinking about specific inputs.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, so if you recall that the relationships here, we're modeling a relationship-specific things rather than things you can buy off the shelf. And when you look at that level, things are close to being a directly acyclical graph.
No, but I really appreciate Francis' question because I think the general. So incidentally, this maximum functioning set thing, Francis realizes this. That part is totally general and works for any structure of production as long as you have a monotone kind of fixed point. As Matt E just said, the probability theory of what we're doing is using the nice structure that we're assuming, but it's a beautiful set of questions actually for probabilists to understand how much cycling we can theoretically bear and get our main results. And I think that we hope to stimulate, to the extent that people are interested in more of the technical sides of this. I would love to hear more. I would love to see, some of the math that would flow out of looking at more interesting supply structures than the simplified one that we have. So let me show you the first mechanical result, this discontinuity that I just sort of alluded to in words or promised you. This picture, what it shows is on the y-axis, the probability that a random firm can successfully produce. That's the reliability of the economy. That's on the y-axis. What's on the horizontal axis is the probability that each relationship is operational, this x. And we're in this case where this is done for 2, so 2 inputs for each and 2 possible firms. You could do it for any pair of numbers. And you can see that this has a precipice. So that's the first observation. At some critical value of x, suddenly you can't make, you suddenly, fall off the cliff and your production goes to 0, even though, here, like more than 60% of your pipes are working. So it's not a question. It's not because your economy was like mechanically disabled, but something, if it's not enough pipes are working, this arbitrary kind of, well, not arbitrary, but this cutoff, so that makes a huge difference. And if you go just above that, you can produce, for a huge share of the firms can produce, and here a small share of the firms. And in fact, a lot of the symmetry and kind of simple assumptions we're making are just to make this point transparent and to show we're not pulling something secret over on you. It comes out very naturally, even out of the simplest model. Let me contrast this with, if you have what we call simple production, where you only have one input at each stage of production that is indispensable and specifically sourced, then the picture looks like this, and you don't have a discontinuity. What m equals 1 means is not literally that each product has one physical input. That would be bizarre, but that there's only one that's sourced through these failure-prone relationships. So you get everything as commodities, you buy cheap labor, on an open labor market, but you do have you know, one input that you need a special contract to get, and failures in that will not result in the stark precipice for a simple economy, but they do kick in once your economy gets more complex. So this proposition formalizes the precipice result that was, you know, presented here pictorially. It says that the features that I showed you, well, certain features that are evident in this picture are general. So there's a single discontinuity. The function is strictly increasing after that. And actually, you know, around here at the discontinuity, if you're curious, the marginal returns in reliability to making your X, your pipes a little bit better, actually is infinite, gets infinite. So it's a transition that's discontinuous and has a very steep derivative there. If you have this simple case, then rho of X is continuous. So everything here is the symmetric case where all firms look sufficiently the same in the sense that they need the same number of inputs and and have the same number of sourcing opportunities for each. But that is really not important. So if you look in sort of toward the back of the paper, you can define the model if you know about multi-type branching processes and that kind of thing, where you can put kind of all the heterogeneity you might want in this process. The key insight that you'll have, the precipice survives. So it's not. We've been asked periodically, like, oh, it must be because your economy is so symmetric that it has this precipice, and that's just not so. It's because it's complex. It's because you need two inputs at every stage of production to function that the economy is so ends up so sensitive, you know, at least somewhere to this X. So I guess because this is a technical audience, I'm gonna zoom super fast through the kind of idea of the argument for why there's a precipice without being able to do it full justice. But a thought experiment you can imagine is take a typical firm and imagine that each of its suppliers functions with a given probability. Remember when we were turning the nodes red or not? Imagine that the probability that you stay not red, that you function, is RS for each of your suppliers, right? And so now we'll ask the probability, so the probability that each of your suppliers remains good is RS. And then we'll ask, given the randomness of the pipes from you to them, and the randomness in exactly who functions and who doesn't, what's the probability that you can function, right? And that can be computed, that's this left-hand side, it can be computed as a function of their probability of working, and X, which is the quality of the pipes. And it's some function that you could work out as a very easy probability exercise. And it turns out that the largest fixed point of this function is equal to the reliability, the economy, that is the share of firms in this maximal consistent F. So there's and this is not trivial, this is a little lemma, but in short, there's a function you can define whose biggest fixed point captures the reliability of the economy. So I'm skipping how exactly you work that out, but let me plot it for you, right? So here on the x-axis is the probability that each of your suppliers is functional. Here on the y-axis is the probability that you're functional. This is for a fixed x, let's say x equals 0.7, right, or 0.9. And you can see how this curve looks. And the lemma says that the biggest fixed point of this is going to be the reliability of the economy. Okay. Now, what's happening here in this picture is we're varying x, moving this whole curve, and tracking the location of this biggest intersection, right? And so you can see that as you decrease x, what's going to happen is that the biggest intersection is going to slide down. And eventually, at some moment, it's going to be just existing, and then it's going to disappear. Like here, you can see that at x equals 0.7, there is no non-trivial intersection. And that's when we drop down to 0. So that's kind of what accounts for the discontinuity. And incidentally, I should tell you that, you know, you can see that the kind of S shape is critical to the fact that the fixed point disappears. If we had a shape that was different, that was concave all the way, then you could have the fixed point disappearing continuously. And that's familiar to some of you from random graph theory or some game theory platform models. So you can have, it turns out in the simple case, you have a shape where the fixed point goes down to 0 nicely. And here you have a shape that it goes down to 0 abruptly, and it comes from this. So that's kind of the spirit of the proof. Let's see. Yeah. So Junji asks a good question. Why the biggest fixed point? And what if you had selected the smallest fixed point? It turns out that in this economy, it's the biggest fixed point that captures the maximal consistent functioning set. And it, other fixed points might have a meaning, but I'll give you the simplest interpretation, which is that if you truncate, imagine you didn't really believe in infinite kind of supply chains that go on, and you wanted to truncate your supply chains, and at some point you just need raw materials, and those nodes are not reliant on anything. If you do that truncation of the model, and then you ask who can function, do our little tree algorithm that I showed you before, that's going to give you the largest fixed point. So we have an argument based on finite approximation that shows that the largest fixed point is the real one and not some other one. That's sort of, it's not like an equilibrium selection choice. It's more fundamental than that. But incidentally, if for whatever reason you did care about this fixed point, note that it has the same discontinuous speed. It has the discontinuity, but it's not the right one to focus on. So it's really the top one, and the paper kind of explains why. Okay. Super unfair, quick literature review. Complementarities are a huge deal in trying to explain phenomena in macro and other fields that seem difficult to explain without them. And that goes back at least to Cramer's O-rings. We combine the fact that a lot of complementary inputs go into an Airbus with the idea that they're sourced specifically. And there's a lot of important papers in contract theory and relational contracting and beyond economics that look at the importance of contracts and specific relationships in markets, organizational sociology, that kind of thing. Now, related to the complementarities thread, production networks have recently been a huge area of interest, with beautiful, a well-known paper by Asimoglu and co-authors, a series of papers by David Bakai and Emmanuel Farhi, who put complementarities in networked production processes. Those models are all smooth macroeconomic models. So if you want to differentiate them at around any equilibrium, you can. And they can get amplification that's big because derivatives are big, but by design, they don't have any discontinuities. They don't have any discontinuities. They don't have anything like this. And for us, that comes fundamentally from the random graph theory that we have, and they don't. Now, finally, there's maybe closer to the interests of this audience, a huge literature on network formation, connections to systemic risk. We focus on, motivated by the last crisis, a lot of literature is focused on risk in the financial economy and formation of financial networks. We focus on the real economy, and fragility in that seems to be something that's going to become very important, thanks to this crisis. And finally, there's literatures in engineering and math, which have some phase transitions, and we're happy to talk more about connection, exactly how we fit into that. But basically, our contribution is, even in the simplest economic models, you see these stark discontinuities which haven't been really appreciated when it comes to like basic, production network economics. Okay, so I've already promised you that if the economy is heterogeneous, we can get precipices, and I'm going to just assert that and say no more about it. You might ask some more questions, like, when you have an economy that's rather than having one N&M, having lots of N&Ms, lots of different production processes, maybe interlinked somehow, maybe that kind of richer, smoother economy will get rid of all the stark phenomena. And kind of more importantly, we see that here there is a precipice, but you could well ask, in an equilibrium of an economy, will you be anywhere near it? Maybe you'll be over here, and the fact that somewhere there's this cliff, like over there far away there's a cliff, but I live over here 5 miles from the cliff, so I don't care. That might be what equilibrium gives us, that we're far away from the cliff in terms of the actual X in the economy. So analyzing whether we will get close to the precipice endogenously is what the rest of the paper is about. Okay. And I think some of the questions in the chat anticipate this. So for the rest of the talk, we're going to focus on the symmetric supply network without apology, promising you that the key insights don't depend on that. And we're going to endogenize relationship strength and show you how indeed the precipices will matter even then. So the endogenizing happens in 2 steps. It's going to be, the going gets a little quick here, but I'll try to be brief, clear on the key things. Rather than one X being chosen throughout the economy, we're going to make X a choice that each sourcing firm makes. So when I'm trying to source from the mats, I decide the probability that the pipe works, that delivers their stuff to me, right? And we're going to be studying symmetric equilibria where everybody ends up choosing the same X, but everybody has the right to deviate to any X that they want for their suppliers. And in fact, you could even do this supplier by supplier if you wanted, but we're going to just for simplicity say that you choose the same the same sourcing reliability, the same sourcing X from all your suppliers. And then in order to think about what firms are going to do, of course, we need to give them some payoffs. So the payoffs are going to be ones I hope you find natural. If you manage to produce, you make a gross profit. That's called G, okay? Now, of course, you only make it in the events where you are functional. And it's easy to write a formula given the reliability that all other firms have in the symmetric equilibrium and the pipe strength that you choose from your suppliers. You can write the probability that you'll be functional. It's some simple formula. It's in fact written out here. Of course, reliability isn't free, and in order to make your pipes work, in order to increase your probability of producing, you will pay an investment cost, which is some increasing convex function with some Inada assumptions of your X level that you choose. And so now, rather than X being given by some grand, X is like a socialist economy where someone prescribes, how hard the managers work to manage their contracts. Here, that's a choice that every firm makes, and we're going to be studying symmetric equilibria of those decentralized choices. So let me just show you in a picture, because I think that's probably the easiest way to understand what. So let me just feel free to ask questions about the structure of the payoffs. But it's just very simple. Pay for the links you make and get a gross profit if you manage to produce, right? For now, this number is just an exogenous given number. The last step of the economic model will endogenize it, okay? So remember this precipice picture, that's from over there, right? So this picture was just the physics of the situation, that as X increases, at some point, rho of X jumps in a symmetric equilibrium. But there's another curve that we can now pay attention to, which is, here's what I want you to imagine. Imagine that other firms are reliable, have a reliability of R. So they manage to produce with a reliable, 92% of your suppliers are up at any given time. Their uptime is 92%. What X investment do you want to choose then? We call that BR of R. That's your best response investment level when each supplier is successful with probability R. And this kind of has intuitive properties, right? If all my suppliers are never up, then it doesn't make any sense to build pipes that will never get me anything. If they're up a huge fraction of the time, I don't really have to work that hard to make many pipes work, because any pipe I extend successfully will get me stuff. And it has some shape, okay? Which won't necessarily look this nice. But one thing you can think about is, well, what if this G, this gross profit that I make when I manage to produce, goes down? Well, in that case, of course, I'll have lower incentives to invest because I make less when I succeed, and this curve will shift. And so what we can show is, I'll tell you formally in a second, but what we can show is that, at some point, this will hit this precipice point, and if you degrade G beyond that, you'll actually not be able to produce again at all. So first, the discontinuity that we saw in X is inherited by this more economic model because of the way this intersection works. And I guess probably worth saying that a little bit more formally. So let me just leave this picture up. But more formally, the housekeeping we do at this stage is we show there's a unique positive investment equilibrium in this game that we've described. And moreover, as you vary G, this thing is monotone. So once you have uniqueness, it's an easy thing to show monotonicity. You vary, you make profits better, and people want to invest more. And those features actually, while they seem completely obvious in the picture, because this game, the functions here, the best response functions, do depend in a complicated way on the structure of the random graph. It's not so obvious to prove this fact, and once you have it, you're in business and you can do more economics. But this is one of the harder, this is a result that we had to work hard to establish. But it just shows that the symmetric equilibrium in this investment game works in the intuitive way. So let me stop here for a second, and feel free. Please don't be shy. Please ask lots of questions, because it's getting, somewhat dense now. So the takeaways from this short section where we're just endogenizing investment are fairly, this is an intermediate waypoint before getting to the main punchline, that gross profits make firms invest more. As we degrade gross profits, we approach the precipice, and a small shock can cause production to collapse. And you might, by the way, say, this applies even to the first part. You might say, well, why is this drop so stark? Do you really think production networks will just fail completely? We don't necessarily think that. There might be backup sourcing that you could switch to, right? That would be another endogenous choice. You could just switch to some worse production process where you try to get off-the-shelf parts and customize them yourself. Firms do, in fact, do that. And then you would get the same discontinuities, but you wouldn't get, a full drop. You would get a drop of some chunk, and that would still have, very similar qualitative properties, but you could get the quantitative details to match reality better. There's a question that was just popped up in the Q&A. So the last part of the talk addresses a question that I think you should have at this point, which is that, in some sense, we've just pushed back the question one step. I told you that, you might have G's that put you on the precipice and might make you fragile, but are you actually likely, will gross profits be like that? Or will they be so big, maybe gross profits are really big in some industry, and so all firms have incentives to invest in reliability so that they stay far away from this precipice, right? And then again, precipice wouldn't really be a concern. So in the last step of the talk, what we do is we endogenize the gross profits by allowing firms to choose whether to enter. So we're going to do a pretty standard kind of, market analysis where who is trying to produce is endogenous, and that affects the profits any firm can make. And in this last bit of the talk, what we'll see is that there's a systematic force putting parts of the economy on the precipice, and being on the precipice is not a knife-edge situation, but in fact obtains for an open range of parameters in when we kind of vary the economy and let everything adjust at the same time. That's the key claim. So if you thought the precipice was this measure zero oddity, in the sense that, well, it only happens, it only happens at this one point, I'm going to show you that there's something driving the whole economy to configure itself in a configuration that looks exactly like this, even without having to contrive it that way. So that's sort of the last claim. And in order to make that last claim precise, I need to add that one little bit of endogeneity to the model, which I promised you, where G is going to be endogenous. So same model as before. The only additions now are that firms are going to decide whether to enter or not, and kind of as a standard, we're going to have an entry cost, which depends on your firm label. So the firms that have higher labels are going to have higher entry costs. There's just some CDF of entry costs out there in this product. And after the firms that decide to pay this fixed cost and enter are going to play an investment game among themselves, as described already. So everything is exactly the same as I showed you in the first part. The only thing that's added now is this entry cost, which is what you have to pay to play at all. And now the other difference, which I want to spend a little bit of time on, is that the gross profit that you make when you enter is now not an exogenous number, but a function of rho I times F bar I. So what is this? Okay, what is this? Rho I is defined to be the fraction of firms in your product that are functioning. And F bar is the entry cutoff in your product. So it's the share, it's the last firm that enters, or equivalently the mass of the firms that enter in your product. So how should you read this? Well, it's just the mass of firms, the number of firms in your product that are managing to produce. This is the number that tried, and this is the number that actually, of that, the probability that they succeed. And so we're just going to make an assumption that your gross profits are decreasing in the crowdedness of the product market, these firms that are trying to compete with you. And there are many micro foundations that are totally standard, which we deal with in the appendix and so forth. But the key idea is just you in a more crowded market, you probably serve less of the demand, and you also make less of a markup. So it's natural to assume that you make less money. And that's it. That's the profit function for this endogenous exercise. So what we're going to study is symmetric equilibria of this big economy, of this now, when we put everything in. So a symmetric equilibrium is going to be characterized by a cutoff, F bar star for everyone, and an investment level, so that two things are true. First, conditional on entering, firms are playing an equilibrium of the investment game, which we've already discussed. Sort of the investment subgame is in equilibrium. And then firm entry is optimal, so that no positive mass of firms can change their entry decisions and do better. For example, it shouldn't be that there's a positive mass of firms that is not entering and could make positive profits by entering, and vice versa. So those are the assumptions, those are the properties defining an equilibrium. And now I can tell you the main result that I promised you about the robust existence of this precipice problem. In order to do that, we're going to parameterize our economy. We're going to take the economy we've been studying, but add a parameter which shifts institutional quality. So actually, one example that we've moved a little bit away from this recently, but it's an example that we like and we think is real. Is like court congestion, right? Imagine that the quality of the courts is something that's given by the politics of your province or country, and if courts get better, it's much easier to sustain a given level of reliability. So it basically shifts down the effective cost of kappa is the courts get better, and you can get the same X for less money, right? Because it's easier to write contracts, because you can actually sue people. And so that is a, you can equally, by the way, put kappa, not instead of putting it here, you could put it as a multiplier on the profits, a productivity shifter, and it will work the same. But basically, economies with higher kappa are better. And what we're going to study is how the equilibria of this big economy that I've introduced depend on kappa, how they shift around as we shift kappa. Matt, anything to say from the chat?
John G asked an interesting question about, besides the symmetric equilibria, what other kinds of equilibria are, and that started a little thread. And his thought was the investments are complements, which I don't, which they're not, sometimes they're substitutes, sometimes they're complements. But and I also said that our best guess is that all equilibria are symmetric and there aren't asymmetric ones. And I guess I should try and explain why why we think that's the case. And so in this model, the firms are zero measure. So if you consider a firm's problem and what it has to do, it's facing the same problem as another firm. So we think that it's likely to want to choose even if you take an economy where different firms are doing different things, and then you pick a given firm, it's still facing the same problem that other firms are facing. And so we'd expect the solution to be the same.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. No, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, that's it, please.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's very much how I think of it. And now, of course, in an economy with real heterogeneities, if you start building different, different sectors are different complexities, if you allow different complexities, heterogeneous number of suppliers, of course, stuff would get more complicated, and you would definitely have asymmetries, and you'd have to study that numerically, and we have numerical reasons to think that the basic insights we're pushing are robust, and we even have some theoretical reasons. But in symmetric economies, I don't think asymmetric equilibria are a big deal. Now, Conan asks a question that I like. Do we allow he noticed this aspect of the definition that says that we can't have a positive measure of firms wanting to deviate. And he said, well, what if it's not a positive measure? The short answer is we actually do rely because the equilibria in this model are a little bit unusual and have firms perched on a precipice where any positive measure change in entry will make a huge difference. But a zero measure change won't make any difference. That creates, it's a little bit, we actually do use this part of the definition, but it's not a big deal. If you look in the paper, there's a section about banks and micro-founding that assumption, using a more standard assumption about entry. There's also maybe more substantively the fact that when you do finite approximations of our game, all these things that work in this, all these things we do with continuum tricks extend to totally standard statements in a finite model with suitable approximation. So it's not a silly question. You're highlighting sort of a delicate aspect of using a continuum model here, but it's one we've worried about a lot. So these assumptions have some oddities, but they're ones that we've handled with robustness checks in other ways. I know that's a kind of vague answer, but it's a great question. So the last thing I want to show you before we're done is our main result about criticality. So remember, kappa is the shifter. As kappa gets higher, the economy gets better. And our main result is that the economy is ordered into 3 regimes as kappa changes. When kappa is really bad and your courts, you can't go to court and the roads also don't work, then there's no positive investment equilibrium. This economy is just not productive enough to give everybody incentives to invest. And so nobody would invest if they entered, nobody enters, everything is bad. Then if kappa, let's skip this middle one. If kappa is really high, the economy is very productive. It actually is true that the economy can end up in this nice part of the picture that we were discussing here, where we're well away from the precipice. But what's interesting is that there's an open set, and often not in any way small when we've actually computed it, where we are at a critical equilibrium, which means we're exactly here endogenously. Firms enter just to the point that they drive down gross profits so much that they all want to invest exactly here. And if any more firms were to enter, or if kappa were to get shocked down at all, then you would actually lose the capacity to produce a positive amount, right? And so the surprising part is that for a whole range of kappas, you end up at this same bad spot. And explaining why, I'm very reluctant to ever go over time at all. Explaining why is challenging. Let me try in one sentence. If you're here, and so, say we're in some range here, what's going on is that if we were here, firms have incentives to enter because they're still making enough profit to enter and the marginal firm can cover its cost of entry. And they'll keep entering until here, which is where any more entry would actually, hurt the whole economy, would result in a big output drop. So then after that, no more firms can be born in the market. Now, what if we moved kappa a little bit to some nearby other kappa in the same range? well, then actually we would go back to something more like this. But now again, it would be profitable to enter. More firms would crowd in, pushing it back down here, right? So there's a whole range where, on the one hand, your economy is getting better, but as it gets better, more firms crowd in, pushing you back down toward the precipice. And that's an open condition. There's nothing about that that's inherently, fragile. So, and of course, at these, the last thing to say is that criticality implies fragility. I don't need to say much about that. Basically, if you have a little shock at this point to X, everybody was hoping for this X, but the actual X you get is a little worse because we have a surprise pandemic. Then the economy, if it was configured here, will suddenly drop to zero production, and you will, or in these richer models, it dropped not to zero, but to some much lower level than you had before, because firms have to switch to bad backups. And so that's sort of, there's a lot more to say about interpretations and implications. Maybe for a theory audience, the one concluding comment I'll make is that we've presented a continuum random graph model where people choose probabilities of linking rather than choosing specific links. So like, people in this audience like Junji and Sudipta and Francis have worked on models where there's a lot of detail in which links we work on. We target our investments and our play very specifically to counterparties. Here, there's more of a kind of market level, like a choice that's more in the spirit of platform models, maybe kind of this big homogeneous choice throughout the economy. But we can still study network phenomena because these random trees are definitely networks. And as you can see, we can have outcomes tractable enough that you can then do optimization theory on them. You can do financial network applications using the same technology, but we hope that this will be a tool that modelers use beyond the particular economic applications, that you can study models of network formation in newly tractable ways. And that's maybe where I'll stop. Thank you for the great questions so far. And if the organizers say we have a little time, we're happy to take a few more.
Maybe one or two more questions very quickly. We are just past the hour, but
do we go? So if you stop on time, I'm happy to stop, but totally up to you.
I mean, if there is a quick one or two questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, I think seems not. So thank you, Ben, for a great talk, and Matt E and Matt L. Thank you all for chiming in. It's great. And I want to say bye to all of you. The next speaker in the series is Kalyan Chatterjee, so you will hear from all of us. It'll be around the same time, maybe shift a little bit, but I hope to see you all soon. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.